That was the one without Elvis, by the way. It was the 62 where, I guess, he showed up. Our next presentation is a panel of 3 people, but they're going to take turns being up here one at a time. And they are people who have been involved in this community research. And I'm going to introduce them. I'm going to introduce all 3 of them, and then I'll let them take over one by one. The program is called Chicago Health and Flowers at the AYP. And our presenters are going to be, I presume in the order of which Chicago Health and Flowers, are Rob Ketcherside, Kathy Likes, has a lot of fans out in the audience. I don't know why you don't, Rob.
I'll try to make some fans.
Okay, and Kathy Mendelson. Okay, so I'm going to turn the mic over to Rob and take it away.
Much better. Test. All right, my name is Robert Ketcherside, and I was a participant, or I am a participant, in the Discovering AYP project that Lorraine and her compadre Helen Diviak have been leading for the last 6 or 7 months. And I'm going to present to you a little bit of information about Chicago Association of Commerce Day, the most exciting day at the fair, which I chose as my research project. And I chose it because it seemed incredibly boring. I thought, here's something that if I could ever find something interesting, that would be very, very fulfilling, wouldn't it? So, I'm going to jump right in here. So up here is a picture which you probably cannot see particularly well. It's a picture of 40 guys standing in front of the forestry building at the fair. The forestry building, if you haven't heard about it already or read about it already, you're going to run into it at some point. They talked about it in the Pacific Magazine article last weekend. It had these huge trees that were uncut. So it was cut, but unfinished. So it was just neat, like virgin logs that were used to build the building. And it was a really common site for portraits. So here, the 40 members visiting from the Chicago Association of Commerce are standing on the steps. And if you could see a little bit better, I'd ask you what kind of questions you might come up with when looking at this. It's interesting that Lorraine mentioned the costumes at the fair and cigarettes, because recently when I looked at this, I realized that every single one of these guys is wearing an entirely different outfit. They have different coats, different shirts, different ties, different shoes. And so one question you might come up with if you looked at this was, why are they all dressed so differently? Are they different backgrounds? Is it because they're representing different industries, different levels of financial fortunes in the industries they're working in? Another one is that a lot of them are carrying cigars, which Lorraine mentioned that the cigarettes were banned at the fair. But here's the guys, you got an official portrait. They just came out of an official luncheon, and they're all carrying cigars. So why are cigars okay and cigarettes not? Or is it okay for some people and not other people? That's another question you might run into. Personally, I was really naive when I looked at this. I said, hey, here's a bunch of guys. Who are they all? And why did they come to Seattle? And what do they think about Seattle? And I say naive because 40 people is too many to try to... I learned that 40 people is too many to try and tackle with that. If it was 1 or 2 of them, maybe, right? But you cannot look up the census background and family history and what the businesses were for each of them. So, but I did find some really good information about 2 of the guys that I'm going to try and relate to you. And then also, I'm going to try and capture just how fun it was for me to do the research at the end. Alrighty, I guess time for the next slide. Oh, right. That was okay. So what you can't see here is that I've highlighted one guy. There's one guy in the back there that has got a square around him. He's really happy. He's got some glasses on. Some of the guys were very formal and stodgy, but this guy's really happy and exuberant. And the reason why he's acting differently is that he's a reporter. There were 5 reporters that traveled with the exposition, or with the delegation to the exposition. And this guy's name was Richard Henry Little. He went by the nickname of Dick, which I'm going to say this, and I have every right to say this, and you can't be offended by it because this was his name. His name was Dick Little. So there you go. That's his name. And he was well known across the country. He was a war correspondent who traveled to Russia and Japan and the Philippines and Mexico, Cuba, all over the place. And he also, strange combination, he also was a really well-known humor writer. So he wrote about wars and he wrote comedy, and it's a really weird combination. So he as well as the other four guys would write daily about their trip across the country to Seattle from Chicago, and they would show up in all the Chicago papers. And also, when he got back to Chicago, he wrote this really long humor piece about Puget Sound, which kind of teased Tacoma quite a bit, but Tacoma liked it. They thought it was very humorous. I had a really minor comment about Everett. Everett was totally offended. They were really riled up by it. But he also talked about Seattle a little bit in that column. So I'll share a little bit with you about what he had to say about Seattle. So you can see a big arrow probably is all that you can see on this photo, right? So what I've got here is on the right-hand side is a photo of Madison Street, looking from First Avenue all the way up. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with how steep downtown is, and how bad it can be to try to walk up those hills. Is anybody from the Midwest here? Midwest people, all native Seattleites? Anyways, so they were from Chicago, obviously, right? They hadn't been to Seattle before. They got here, steep hills, and they were out carousing one night and had to get back to their hotel, which is way at the top of the hill there, the Perry Hotel, which is where Virginia Mason is now. And unfortunately, the cable car broke down, and they had to walk all the way up Madison Street to get there. And I've got a little quote here I'd like to share with you that he had to say. He says, "Seattle was not entirely to the liking of the Chicago visitors. We are a plains people, and haven't the muscular development required to walk about Seattle. We blew like porpoises in making the ascent and sat down every half block to rest." So this is his strongest memory of Seattle is trying to walk back up Madison Street. He also, as they were resting every half block, they would get passed by lots of people. And here's another photo you can't see. It's looking up Madison Street, so I'll have to act this out. So he has another quote that's really great, where he realizes they're being passed by all these people, and don't seem to be affected by the steep hills. He says, "The Seattle folk trudged stolidly by us, without a sign of discomfort. They had a certain way of walking, a sort of trick that we lacked. They tacked gently from one side of the sidewalk to the other, and carried their bodies with a sort of loose, swaying motion." So this is how Seattleites apparently compensated to get up the hills, was by zigzagging up the sidewalk. And I don't know if you guys, you've obviously probably haven't been looking for this, but after you leave today and you're wandering around downtown, I encourage you all to look at the way people walk. It's obvious to see the tourists. They can't handle it. They all get winded. They really can't take the hills. And the Seattleites do have a weird saunter, like they kind of sway side to side. I don't know if it's the Birkenstocks or what it is, but there's a weird saunter to the Seattleites. So keep your eye on that. Alrighty. So luckily for Dick Little, here's a photo of some cars driving down a dirt road in the midst of beautiful large pine trees. So imagine that scene. So luckily for Dick Little, they were driven around by car most of the time that they were in Seattle. And you can imagine there's 40 people visiting. They had drivers and they had escorts. There's a lot of people to be in cars. It must have been 20, 25, 30 cars. This caravan of 20 cars maybe driving around Seattle. It had to have been a real scene to the people of Seattle. Because I was doing some internet research the other day, discovered that there was only 4,500 cars registered in the entire state of Washington. And here we have 30 in a row that are just crammed full with people. I don't know if they're hanging out the windows screaming or not, but even if they weren't really excited, it would have been quite a sight to see. And this photo was on Interlochen Boulevard. This isn't a photo of them, by the way, but a photo of Interlochen Boulevard. And they were taken on a tour around Capitol Hill and Beacon Hill and had lunch in Georgetown. And then on the way back from Georgetown to their hotel on First Hill, they would have seen a scene like this, which maybe you can see a little bit. There's a bunch of weird outlines. Most people are familiar with the Denny regrade, where Denny Hill was cut down. That was going on at this time. But also, what we know as the International District now was a ridge between First Hill and Beacon Hill, and that was being cut apart right as these guys were in town in 1909. So on their way back into First Hill, they would have seen the delayed or the stalled construction on First Hill, or next to First Hill. And he has a nice quote about that as well. Let me share that. So remembering all the construction work that happened on Seattle, he says, "Seattle was built with a scoop shovel and the hydraulic sluice, and the work was well done too." You can imagine that he was realizing there's one less hill that he's gonna have to try to walk up if he ever comes back to Seattle in the future. All right, so all right, one more quote from Dick Little. This is the AYP, and this is a guy who is from Chicago. He's been at the Chicago Fair, was mentioned earlier. All the people in the trip had. So I really take what he has to say for the fair not with a grain of salt. I take it very literally. I think he had a really good opinion of the fair. What he had to say was, "No exposition was ever more prettily set. The buildings are under great pine trees, and everywhere are beds of gorgeous flowers and bowers of roses and clinging vines." So it wasn't the buildings, like as Lorraine mentioned, it wasn't the buildings that made the fair unique. Maybe it wasn't the traveling circus troops that made it unique. It was the presentation of the fairgrounds and the backdrop of the Northwest in Seattle. Alrighty, so I talked a lot about this guy in Chicago. I said that one of my points was what did they think of Seattle, or why did they come here? So what did they think of Seattle I covered? So why was there a Chicago Association of Commerce Day? If you guys have been to a sporting event recently, maybe you ran into like a hat day where you got a free hat, or there was maybe you're looking at the Jumbotron and there's some guy proposing to his girlfriend on the Jumbotron, and then you notice, hey, wow, they're welcoming all these groups here. So here's a photo from Phoenix Suns where they're welcoming FBLA. So the same sort of thing was happening at the Association of at the exposition, where they're welcoming all these groups to town, and they're welcoming or they're giving free admission to all the Smiths in Seattle, and so Smith Day, all the Smiths got free admission. And the same thing happened here, where they're just honoring a visiting group. That's really all it amounts to. There was nothing exciting on Chicago Association of Commerce Day if you weren't a member of the association. And it was really just to recognize this prominent group of businessmen that are visiting the city. Alrighty, so I've got about 5 minutes left. I think I want to spend just a minute talking about the association itself. So the association was formed a few years before the fair, in 1904, and there were already 10,000 members of the fair 10,000 members of the exposition in 1909. So in 5 years they managed to amass 10,000 members. And to put it in context, that's about half of the population of Everett at the time, in just this one association. So they were really a powerful group nationwide in business, and they were looking at the Northwest as this untapped opportunity for them. Earlier there was a question about why wasn't this fair named after Seattle? When the president of the delegation talked about the fair, he talked about it as an opportunity for Seattle to make money off of the surrounding territories. Basically, he called it an exposition by one live city solely in the interests of a part of its distributing territory. So he says, here's Seattle honoring everybody who gave it money, basically, and they plan to get money from in the future. And that's what the Chicago Association of Commerce was doing as well. They were coming to Seattle to and visiting, and all the other cities they stopped at, to recognize them and try to make more money off of them in the future as well. All right, so there's a couple more comments I thought I would make about why they visited, but I think since I'm running low on time, I'm going to skip forward to talking about my research a little bit. So I mentioned I was naive in choosing kind of a broad topic. It was a broad question on an obscure topic is the real problem. So it was so obscure that when I tried to follow up using the resources that Lorraine had gathered and is presented on the AYP 100 website, there was very little that came out. There was a letter from the governor of Washington to them that I found, and a few other things like that. And I ended up spending all my time, like the woman that she mentioned, I spent all my time looking through newspapers. So I don't know if you guys have any favorite online newspaper databases. Anybody? No, probably not. There's some really good ones out there, like the Library of Congress has a good one. There's some good private ones that ProQuest manages. And if you have any questions about that you want to answer for yourself from that time frame, I really recommend digging online and then immediately going to the University of Washington especially, and also the Seattle Public Library, to dig through their microfilm. So this was, oh man, it's a great photo, you can't see it. This is a photo cut from a magazine from the 50s of a woman standing next to a microfilm machine, and she's profiling it, and she's got a great dress on. Anyway, so I had my own favorite microfilm machine at the University of Washington that I spent hours and hours and hours and hours with, I really relied though on archivists at historical societies and at museums to guide me towards the resources that I ended up finding. And if based on your reaction to whether you had a favorite database, I guess you probably haven't done a lot of this kind of digging before. I really encourage it. There's a lot of really amazing stuff out there. And if you don't have a particular topic that you're interested in trying to research, you can just go to the UW, open a random drawer, pull out a random reel, go to a random page, and it's guaranteed to be something interesting on there. One of the favorite things I had as I was unrelated things that I ran across. Well, oh, this is the one thing you can see. This is great. So there was one particularly exciting thing that I ran across as I was digging through all of this stuff, and it was just sitting next to an article that I was interested in. It was this advertisement that says, "Men, I'll cure you with electricity," and it's just amazing. Like, what is this all about? And it's a product called Electro Vigor, and it says, "We are not an electric belt." I'm like, what? I'm like, what are you then? What is an electric belt? So it ends up, this was like a precursor to Viagra, where you would stick an acid-powered battery that's attached to a belt, and you'd wear it overnight with electrodes. And I don't want to know any more than that, but the title is just amazing. This, "I'll cure you with electricity." I was so impressed by this ad copy that I suggested it to some friends of mine in Japan who were releasing an album. They're like a punk rock band. And here's their album on HMV Japan. They titled their album "I'll Cure You with Electricity" because they were so impressed. I never told them that it was a precursor to Viagra, but I don't know if they'd be more impressed by that or not. Just leave it the way it is. Anyway, so I hope that I was able to share with you some of the fun stuff that I found. Hope you enjoyed the hearing about the Chicago Guys' visit to Seattle and some of the excitement of researching projects. Thank you very much.